Buenos días, buenas tardes a todas y todos. Desde Santiago de Chile vamos a dar inicio a esta conferencia de prensa, el lanzamiento del informe anual de la CEPAL, Panorama Social de América Latina y el Caribe 2023, que se está realizando de manera híbrida desde la capital de Chile. Saludamos a las y los periodistas y a todas y todos quienes nos acompañan a través de las diferentes vías de las cuales estamos tratando de llegar hasta ustedes, la plataforma Zoom, el sitio livecepal.org, el sitio web de la CEPAL, cepal.org, además de nuestras cuentas en YouTube, ex Twitter y Facebook. La conducción, por supuesto, de este lanzamiento recae en nuestro secretario ejecutivo, don José Manuel Salazar-Xirinachs. Nos acompañan también en la mesa principal el secretario ejecutivo adjunto, Javier Medina, el señor Alberto Arenas, jefe de la División de Desarrollo Social de la CEPAL, que ha coordinado la elaboración de este informe, el director de la División de Estadística, Rolando Campo, director de ECLAC, División de Población de la CEPAL, Simone Cecchini, la directora de la División de Asuntos de Género, Ana Güesmes, la jefa de gabinete de la Asamblea Ejecutiva, Silvia Hernández, y junto de los oficiales que han estado también dando la coordinación de este documento, Daniela Truco, Andrés Espejo, Claudia Robles y Rodrigo Martínez. Luego de la presentación vamos a dar paso a la ronda de preguntas y respuestas. Le recordamos a los representantes de los medios de comunicación acreditados que sean tan amables de hacernos llegar sus consultas por escrito a través tanto del chat de la plataforma Zoom a la que están conectados, como al correo.
And also the conferencia prensa at eclac.org email address where we will listen to your concerns. So, Executive Secretary, you have the floor.
Thank you, Guido. Good morning. May you all be very welcome to the launching of the Social Panorama of Latin America and the Caribbean 2023. This document, as you know, is published every year in this month, and it analyzes, as from a comprehensive vision, the various aspects of the social reality of the region. The document is coordinated, as has been said, by the Social Development Division of ECLAC, headed by Alberto Arenas, with the support of other divisions, and the heads of those divisions are present with us here today, and likewise the team that has been mentioned. And we certainly thank them all for this effort and for this work. In the 2023 edition, we talk about the progress and the setbacks of the region in terms of inclusive social development. But as last year we focused on the issue of education, this year we're focusing on the specific challenge of labor inclusion as a key axis for more inclusive, wider-ranging social development perspective. The document is available online. It has an introduction and then 4 chapters. As in previous editions, the first chapter shows the evolution of key indices in social terms, such as per capita growth, inflation, household revenues, and also aspects related to poverty and extreme poverty. In Chapter 2, we deal with social labor inclusion as a key axis for inclusive social development in Latin America and in the Caribbean. In Chapter 3, we deal with the challenges of the labor inclusion of women and of migrants in the region. And finally, Chapter 4 reviews the institutional framework of social development policies and their link with labor inclusion and the evolution of social expenditure in our region. In terms of the main messages, the document mentions how several dimensions of social inclusion, such as poverty and inequality, unemployment, reveals a favorable trend. That is what we found, a recovery vis-a-vis the shocks in cascades. However, it also shows that despite some favorable indices, the region is still finds itself in a double structural trap of low growth on the one hand and high levels of poverty and inequality on the other side. Data for 2022 that will be presented in detail in a few minutes show that the percentage of people living in poverty as a regional average went back to the levels prior to the pandemic. But in terms of revenue inequality, we find that inequality has slightly dropped to levels below those registered in 2019. However, it is still very high, and that is the result of an analysis not only of income distribution, but also as a result of the distribution of wealth in the region, the level of wealth concentration. Beyond the data that we will be presenting, I would like to highlight from the very beginning two important messages. First of all, that the high inequality is not only an issue of social justice, but also limits the growth possibilities, because on the one hand, it is associated to lack of access to education and limited social mobility. And on the other hand, it also reduces opportunities to increase productivity associated to the concentration of non-productive revenues. And secondly, the low economic growth disease and low productive transformation that characterizes the region is one of the main obstacles for social inclusion, because labor inclusion requires high and sustainable growth anchored in a virtuous process of productive development and of structural changes. And therefore we say that it's impossible to create a better future for employment if we don't create a better future for production, and vice versa. Thirdly, a region such as ours, characterized by major gaps in the labor market and with high levels of informality, labor inclusion is fundamental to improve economic, labor, and social indices, including especially those related to inequality. For ECLAC, labor inclusion is an objective of social inclusive development that trying to make all members of labor inclusion that they can gain access to decent work, as mentioned by the ILO, with adequate revenues and social protection coverage. In other words, it's not enough to have any type of employment, but it is fundamental for this to be productive, well paid, and with access to social protection. And because of that, our fourth message is that social inclusion and dynamic labor markets on the one hand, together with good social policies on the other, are fundamental aspects in order to struggle against poverty, reduce informality and inequality. In addition, gender gaps when it comes to labor inclusion are determined to a large extent by inequalities in the burden of the care work that lies disproportionately upon the shoulders of women. In the case of migrants, the overqualification and discrimination is something that also impacts labor inclusion. Migrants contribute to the economy, and their contribution increases if we eliminate the barriers for their labor inclusion. And that is a further conclusion and recommendation of the report. We also mentioned that despite the efforts made by governments in order to invest in labor policies, this investment is insufficient. On average, it only represents 0.42% of the GDP, and therefore we need to make greater efforts in order to move from the simple insertion to advance towards labor inclusion. With revenues that are greater than the minimum salary, especially for women and young people. In summary, then, in order to advance towards labor inclusion, the region must advance based on two main pillars. On the one hand, productive development policies that stimulate the demand for work, and also in the design and expansion of active labor market policies focusing on the most vulnerable population and strengthening the institutional framework for these policies and guaranteeing their adequate financing. Now I'd like to offer the floor to the Director of the Social Development Division, Alberto Arenas de Mesa, who will present the main results of this panorama. Thank you, Executive Secretary. Good morning, everyone. The presentation of the Social Panorama of Latin America and the Caribbean 2023 focuses on labor inclusion as a fundamental aspect for social and inclusive development. And this presentation has been divided up into 4 areas. Labor inclusion as a key axis of inclusive social development. After that, we'll talk about the social spending by central government and the spending on labor policies. After that, we will focus on the information and statistics related to poverty, inequality, and income concentration, to finally conclude with some final remarks. Moving on to the first part of this presentation, labor inclusion is indeed a priority challenge for the region. Labor insertion in paid work is fundamental. In other words, labor insertion is fundamental, but it is not enough in order to achieve labor inclusion. You can see on the graphs there, for example, the working population in blue. We find the people employed, in red, unemployed. And 1 out of every 2 persons that are employed are in informal work. A fifth is living in poverty. 4 out of every 10 have revenues less than the minimum salary, and half of them are not enrolled in pension systems. And in consequence, we must move from labor insertion to labor inclusion, which is an axis for inclusive social development. And so labor inclusion is defined in the following manner. It implies labor insertion and working conditions that people can gain access to, as you can see in the diagram. And in order to include, to achieve labor inclusion, we don't need any labor insertion. That work must be well remunerated, inclusive, and with access to social protection. Labor inclusion supports economic growth, productive development, and the reduction of inequalities. And within that prospect, it moves towards inclusive social development. And in order to achieve labor inclusion, we must face up to different barriers and difficulties in order to gain access to decent employment. And for example, there are different dimensions. High social inequality, the institutional framework of weakened social policies, and the productive structure. They all condition the labor inclusion. Labor inclusion means that all members of the labor force can gain access to decent work, ensuring adequate remunerations and a social protection, as mentioned by the Executive Secretary. And in that sense, we need policies and labor inclusion policies that are strengthened and articulated with social protection, with financial sustainability, and with productive development policies. And within that context, making headway in labor inclusion policies is fundamental to reduce informality and inequality. And thus, in this version of the social panorama, we mentioned that any successful strategy for a successful policy must place at the very center labor inclusion, with the expansion and articulation of active and passive policies of the labor market. With regards to active policies, those that relate to the supply, the demand, and labor intermediation, of course, with the strengthening of the labor institutional framework, and thus coordinating these labor inclusion policies with economic growth policies, macroeconomic policies, productive and technological policies, and with social development protection, social protection, care, education, and health. And in that sense, what's a priority is to strengthen labor inclusion policies linked with social protection systems. Labor inclusion policies contribute to the sustainability of social protection systems, and in that sense, social protection, labor inclusion policies, social protection policies include to labor inclusion via different ways. Coordinated strategies to reduce informality and ensure access to social protection, the expansion of contributory coverage of self-employed workers, labor inclusion policies for the most vulnerable population groups, strengthening labor regulations and the institutional framework of labor, income protection policies, comprehensive policies and care policies that facilitate the incorporation of women into work, the development of skills and strengthening of ties between the labor market and the education system, and certainly addressing the gaps in access to health systems. Having reviewed the conceptual framework of labor inclusion presented in this Social Panorama 2023, we provide certain labor figures. And within a context of low growth, labor inclusion is hindered. The increase of labor drops to historical minimums, and you can see that the creation of employment in the 2014 to 2023 decade is the lowest decade since 1950. Within this decade, the rate of employment of people will be 1.26%. And if this is compared to the lost decade between 1980 and 1989, there was at that time 3.2% in 2020. As you can see on this graph, during the pandemic, job creation fell by 8.2%, and it is the only decline recorded in the past 70 years in our region. Likewise, there are historical gender gaps in the labor market. The gender gap in terms of the labor participation was 22.6 percentage points in 2022, and you can see on the graph in the in one of the columns 51.9% in terms of the women's share in labor compared to 74.5% of the share of men. Women have a greater unemployment rates, 8.6% compared to 5.8% for men. And the estimations for 2023 is that the estimation of the average labor participation rate of men and women will be very similar to pre-pandemic levels. We estimate 63% of participation on average in 2023 compared to 63.3% in 2029.
Entre la población, siendo más significativos entre mujeres, jóvenes y personas mayores. La reducción de la tasa de ocupación en
older persons. There, the 2020 rate, the decline in employment rate in 2020 was more pronounced for younger and older persons, and in both cases, the impact was greater in women. Post-pandemic employment recovery was faster for young persons, and figures attained pre-pandemic levels by the third quarter of 2021, and then overtook them at the end of 2022. That was not the case of older persons. Men and women did not reach pre-pandemic rates. You can see there the blue line, men of 65 or over, and the blue one of women 65 or over show declines of 3.6 and 5.8 respectively, as compared to the first quarter of 2019. Another important topic is that the compliance with minimum wage regulations is key to promote labor inclusion. In 2022, 92 million workers in 14 countries of the region had a salary below the official minimum wage. This figure was up from pre-pandemic levels by an additional 13 million workers over the age of 15. You can see 32.6% in 2019 to 36.8% in 2022. The young people and older persons are the ones, those earning below the legal minimum wage, and the percentage of domestic workers earning below the minimum wage is particularly high, and more than 90% of these workers are women. Labor inclusion of women face as main barrier the burden of care work. The labor participation rate of women in households with children is 61.6%, as you can see in the before the last barriers of the graph. And it is lower than in households without children, which is 73.5%. Unequal social distribution of care work and the lack of comprehensive care systems are the main barriers for women's labor inclusion in the market. The increase in care work associated with raising children falls mainly on women and negatively impacts their labor participation. And this affects the poorest women mainly. Those are the groups that have the least possibilities of hiring private services that would alleviate the care work, and thus what happens in the labor market, the income of paid female domestic workers earn much less than the other employed women. The average income of female domestic workers is half that of other employed women. On the graph, it's the yellow bars compared to the blue. The domestic work is one of the main sources of labor for women in Latin America. In the region, the household sector as employers is made up of 92% by women and concentrates more than 10% of employed women. Another topic that was addressed in the social panorama linked to labor inclusion is the emergence of digital platforms, intensifying the challenges in the already precarious paid domestic work sector. Digital transformation is not neutral. It can generate opportunities and job growth and also exacerbate existing gaps. Given the precariousness of the paid domestic work sector, 76.8% of female workers are not enrolled in Social Security, and therefore digital platforms must guarantee decent work. Regulating digital platforms along these lines and improving domestic workers' working conditions are among the main labor challenges in the region. Another topic that is presented in the 2023 social panorama is that of migrants and their labor inclusion. And they're increasing their presence in labor markets of the region and contribute with their work to the economy and society of destination countries. They register both men and women, and in all countries, migrants' labor force participation is higher than that of non-migrants. However, migrants have greater difficulties because they have overburdened and more precarious conditions because of irregularity. Another matter is labor informality. 50%, almost 50% of employed persons have informal jobs. The main challenge for labor inclusion. Informality intersects with the multiple dimensions of gender, socioeconomic, age, ethnic, racial, and territorial. The informal workers are 4 times more likely than formal workers to belong to households of the first income quintile, and the average wage for formally employed persons is between 3 and 4 times higher than the average wage of the informally employed. Levels of labor informality tend to be higher for international migrants and increase with irregular status. And in 11 countries of Latin America, 78% have a member in informal jobs, as you can see on the graph. In 2022, in the second quarter, 54.2 million households, that is 39% of the total, relied solely on informal employment. 25.1 million households, that is 20%, had members working in both sectors, formal and informal. In total, 79 million homes, that is 58% of them, have at least one member working in informality. And thus, in 2022, 21.7 million households that depend solely on informal employment are headed by women. Most children under 15 and persons over 65 live in households that are completely informal or mixed or partially informal. And thus, in the social panorama, the policies of labor inclusion should address definitely informality. Going to the second topic, we will speak about central government social spending and spending on labor policies. Social spending in the region amounted to 11.5% of GDP in 2022, very similar to the social spending prior to COVID-19 pandemic. The triennium 2020-22 show a significant deviation from the trend, with a rise at the start of the pandemic of 11.2 to 13.7%, and then went back to slightly higher levels than 2019, going to 13.4 in 2021 and 11.5 in 2022, which is slightly higher than the 11.2% of 2019. As you can see there, this adjustment was greater than that observed in 2008 and 9, where there was a crisis as well. The share of social spending in total public expenditure also shows like a break, deviated from its trend. However, in Latin America, it still accounts for the largest share of total public expenditure, being 53.4% of the total expenditure. The challenge is to ensure the financial sustainability of social spending and thus inclusive social development policies. In 2022, a high heterogeneity is considered. 3 countries exceeded 14.5% of GDP, and 3 countries are below 10%. And in blue, you can see the sub-region with the highest average spending in South America at 13.2 of GDP, but there's still 2.3 percentage points below the level of 2021. 3 areas, the average for Central America, Mexico, and the Dominican Republic is just 9.5% of GDP, 0.8 percentage points less than 2021. South America and the Caribbean are the sub-regions with the greatest range of situations. In Bahamas, Chile, Colombia, and Guyana, central government social spending is more than 3 percentage points lower in relation to GDP of 2021. Per capita social spending returns to levels seen in 2019 in Latin America and remains above those levels in the Caribbean. Of the sub-regions, the countries of the Caribbean again gave their highest average per capita spending. Average per capita social spending with South America was 1.335, 1.8 times the per capita spending of Central America and Mexico and Dominican Republic. And as all the figures we've shown in 2023 and all of its versions, the per capita social spending is of the central government. And then after that, we focused in social spending, in active labor policies, and in the average spending of the labor market. And thus, active labor policies are key. And during 2022, public spending in labor policies was increased. You can see for 15 countries went from 0.36 points of GDP to 0.98 in 2020. There is a support to the situation of unemployment insurance, and incentives. However, in the final period of the pandemic, going back to the prior situation, it decreased in Latin America and in 0.32% of GDP in 2022. There is a significant difference in Latin America on the left and right side. Europe with 25 countries as comparing both continents. And this accounted by the relevance of passive policies in Europe. There you can see in their light blue bars. Now, going on to the third chapter, poverty, inequality, and income concentration. In 2022, the percentage of people living in poverty in the region returned to pre-pandemic levels. In 2022, the poverty rate was 1.2 percentage points lower than before the pandemic in 2019, while the rate of extreme poverty was maintained in similar levels, unchanged. In 2022, poverty reached 29%, 181 million people in situation of poverty, and 12.2 million or 70 million in extreme poverty. And the rate of economic growth expected for 2023, 1.7%, does not allow to foresee improvements in poverty rates as presented in the estimates of the last 2 bars in what is poverty and extreme poverty in Latin America. The incidence of poverty is greater in some groups of the population in 2022. 29% is population in average terms, but there are realities occurring in certain population groups, especially younger persons and adolescents, that reach 42.5% living in poverty. The poverty rate for women is 1.2 times the rate of men of the same age, of 20 to 59 age group. And other groups of population in poverty that are higher than the average is the indigenous peoples, 43.1%, and the rural communities, which is 41%. In 2022, income inequality fell below 2019 levels. In 9 of the 12 Latin American countries, the Gini index was lower in 2022 than in 2019. You can see the blue triangle in 2019, and almost in all countries, you can see that the orange circle is below, or 9 out of 12 countries is below. The annual average decrease in the Gini index was faster in the period 2019 to 2022, 1.1%, than in 2014 to 2019, which was 0.2% per year. In spite of that, inequality remains very high. And here is the income received by deciles 1, 1 to 4, and decile number 10. In Latin America, the income of the highest income decile, that is the blue bar, has an income that is 21 times that of the lowest income decile, that is the orange bar. High inequality hampers growth as it limits factors including access to education and reduces opportunities to innovate and increase productivity. The high concentration of wealth. In 2021, only 105 people held wealth equaling nearly 9% of regional GDP. You can see in the graph in 2021, the 4.3 billion, or that is $4.3 billion of millionaires, whilst the average wealth of the rest of the population was $18,000. Some final comments in what is labor inclusion to reduce inequality and informality.
Labor inclusion is a critical factor to reduce inequality and informality in the region. We need to make progress and move from social insertion towards labor inclusion in order to ensure quality access to quality employment that pay an above minimum wage and offer social protection, especially for women and for young people. Labor inclusion is closely related, linked to social protection systems. And within that context, that demands comprehensive actions, including access to care and greater educational opportunities. Now, one major reason for the persistence of gender gaps in labor inclusion is the disproportionate burden of care work and care policies, and the deficit of care policies and the system of care in the region. Migrants contribute to the economy increasingly under regular working conditions and with reduced barriers to labor inclusion. And the region must advance towards the design, expansion, and coordination of active labor policies focusing primarily on the most vulnerable populations, strengthening their institutional framework and ensuring their financial sustainability. The efforts undertaken by countries in terms of investment in labor policies, as presented by the Executive Secretary at the beginning, on average, implies 0.42% of the GDP. And this this financial effort, when it comes to labor policy inclusions and labor policies in general, is insufficient in order to deal with this issue. We need countries to invest in labor inclusion, recognizing the key role it plays when it comes to inclusive social development policies and the impact that labor inclusion policies generate upon labor informality. That hinders social inclusive development. And finally, as mentioned by the Executive Secretary, in our version of the 2023 panorama, we find a recovery in some social indicators, but there are still important gaps when it comes to inclusive social inclusion. Poverty, inequality, and employment, for example, reveal indicators that are favorable over the past few years in terms of recovery compared to the damage caused by the shocks in cascade, but the region is still in a double structural trap that we have called a double low growth and high poverty and inequality levels. That is a trap, and that low economic growth hinders labor inclusion. Labor inclusion requires high and sustained growth, and it's impossible to create a better future for work without improving production and vice versa. And in that sense, social expenditure increased in response to the pandemic, but as mentioned, reached its historical peak in 2022, but has been gradually reduced since then. And therefore, we face a challenge in the region, which is the financial sustainability of that social expenditure, and thus a strengthening of labor policies and inclusive social development. Labor inclusion is fundamental to reduce inequality and labor informality, and also to boost economic growth. It is thus fundamental for inclusive social development and in order to improve a better future for the work. And a better future for work will be a central theme of ECOSOC in January 2024 in a special meeting that will be held here in ECLAC. It will be in the debates of the Summit of the Future that will be held in 2024, and certainly, if we make progress, it will also be present in the UN's World Social Summit in 2025. Thank you very much. Thank you, Alberto, Director of the Social Development Division of ECLAC, and now we'll offer the floor to, or we'll open up the Q&A session, thanking the colleagues of the media that have already sent us their questions. And the first question is by Juana Casas, a colleague who is the editor of the Reuters press agency. And the question is the following. In the report, you mentioned the major obstacles faced by young people in order to gain access to the labor market and the high percentage of young people that don't work or study. Is this situation aligned with other trends in the world, or does it have certain specificities in our region? Which would those specificities be? Thank you very much for the question. As mentioned in the panorama, young people in the region face very complex contexts, both in terms of their labor inclusion and also in order to build successful working careers. There are obstacles that are the same as in other parts of the world. For example, barriers to obtain their first employment, because young people there fall into a vicious cycle in terms of not having experience, and therefore they are at the end of the queue in order to obtain a job. And also the pattern that within the economic cycle, and this is well documented, they are the first to be laid off and the last to be rehired. And these are also patterns that can be seen throughout the world, despite the fact that there are policies that reduce these trends. For example, the practice in developed countries of practical work before they graduate, so that they can accumulate experience before their education is over. Now, that type of obstacle means that the employment rate for young people is lower than in adults as a general trend. That is also visible in the rest of the world. For the region, ECLAC figures reveal that for 12 countries in the fourth quarter of 2022, young people had occupation rates that are 25% lower than that of adults aged between 30 and 45 years in the case of men, and 20 percentage points in the case of women. And they also have unemployment rates that are twice that of the age group 30 to 44. However, there are a whole series of specificities in Latin America, and I'll mention several. First of all, over the past decade, as we have insisted, the region has had low growth, and that has been 0.28% per year compared to 2% in the 80s. And this low growth is associated to a low creation of employment, especially formal jobs, and that is a first factor, and that has an impact that is proportionally higher for young people as a result of the structural causes that I have just mentioned. And that is a first element. Secondly, our indices and educational results ours in terms of Latin America and the Caribbean, in terms of professional training, are not good compared to other countries. We have high rates of high dropout rates in secondary education. A large people don't continue higher education, and the minimum education level to gain access to decent work. Therefore, those that conclude their secondary education don't achieve good results in the PISA tests. And all this reduces the level of employability and the level of preparedness of young people in the region for the labor market, especially in modern sectors associated to the technological and scientific revolution. These are part of the factors that imply that 1 out of every 2 young persons in the region, 53.4%, gain access to informal employment, and this is dramatic, and that more than 40% of young people earn less than the legal minimum salary. And thirdly, we cannot only talk about averages. There are enormous inequalities in the distribution of opportunities, educational opportunities, and training opportunities when it comes to young people with different income levels. Higher income levels have greater opportunities for education and training than those that are poorer. And that means that they can normally obtain better jobs and that they have careers that are far more successful during their working lives. How, if we, how, when education begins in early childhood, that has an impact upon the careers of people throughout their lives. And education is indeed one of the main ladders for ascending social mobility. And therefore, the segmentation in terms of the quality of educational systems and the way in which the labor market, which is not very dynamic, reduces inequalities is again a specificity of our region. Fourthly, and very quickly, of course, the shock of COVID may worsen the situation. It has unequal impacts as a result of the lack of education and unequal distribution in terms of who could gain access to connectivity or not. And also, there are enormous, very important issues related to the sexual division of labor, to gender inequalities between men and women and young people. But I don't want to make this a long-winded answer. We have written a lot about this. And finally, there are specificities such as ethnic and racial inequality, gaps associated to people's life cycles, territorial inequalities, and also the whole issue of migration. Thank you. Thank you, Executive Secretary. Now we will receive a question from Carmen Esquivel, who is a correspondent of Prensa Latina. Carmen asks the following question: what are the labor challenges for migrants, considering the increase of intra-regional migration? What conditions should be met in order to achieve gender equality in terms of gaining access to the labor market? And what is the progress and challenges to incorporate care work and domestic work as part of the labor market? Carmen Esquivel from Prensa Latina, Executive Secretary. Thank you, Carmen Esquivel, for your question. With regards to the labor challenges for migrants, the condition of irregularity experienced by many of the migrants, that often leads them to operate on the edges of the labor market, so to speak, and that obviously does not facilitate insertion when it comes to better quality formal work, and that makes them vulnerable to exploitation and also to the exclusion from social security. Now, simplifying this, there are 2 main challenges for the labor insertion of migrants. On the one hand, let's think of low underqualified and highly qualified migrants. In the case of low qualified migrants, the situation of irregularity means that they find employment in sectors with the high impact of informal work. Informal activities are easier to enter, of course. And if there is no relationship of salary dependency, this is conducted outside the framework that regulates the labor market, social protection, and so on. So within the scenario of intra-regional migration that has been so quick and that will possibly continue, the possibility of having regular permanence and labor market participation is fundamental when it comes to responsible management by different administrations. Now, within highly qualified migrants, there are institutional, academic, and cultural barriers that hinder this, and that is very dramatic. The use of their competencies, accreditations, be it because the transfer of prior experience to a new market that has different logics and dynamics is not simple, but generally as a result of the difficulty of officially recognizing their titles or academic credentials, or the difficulty that in some cases these migrants leave with under emergency situations and have no means to go back to their own countries in order to obtain their academic titles and accreditations. They don't have a way of showing the competencies that they have acquired formally, and this applies to doctors, engineers, and so on. Now, that implies average revenues that are far below their national counterparts, and often they have to find informal work. So, this issue of standardizing support programs for labor insertion, both for low qualified and highly qualified migrants, is a fundamental aspect that we have insisted on several occasions, and we're collaborating with other UN agencies on around that issue, and that is one of the big dramas that exists when it comes to this trend of an increase in intra-regional migration. And we also summon governments to make even more efforts in that sense. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Executive Secretary. Now, Paulina Abramovich, head of editorial France Press. Poverty indicators were stagnant in 2023 as compared to 2022, with an estimate of economic growth of 1.7 for this year. Is there any progress in poverty for 2024, or prematurely we can say that there will be another lost year? Paulina Abramovich, France Press. Thank you, Paulina Abramovich, for your question. One first comment is that economic growth measured by GDP is the main element in terms of the projection of poverty that ECLAC conducts from one year to the next. What moves really the panorama, the way it relates, of course, many other elements for poverty reduction, but from one year to the next, policies do not change so much, and that is the economic growth rate. For 2023, with an estimated GDP growth of 1.7 for the region, therefore, it's almost an almost no rate in regional poverty. If maintained at that level, a similar growth forecast for 2024, the poverty rate would be at a similar level than 22-23. We are about to publish, however, in the preliminary balance at the end of the year, a revision of these growth rates, and if there are variations, the comment could change. What I'm saying, with growth rates of 1.7%, the poverty rate will be maintained. If we revisit those rates and move them up, there could be an improvement in poverty and extreme poverty. Perhaps I leave the comment there. Thank you, Executive Secretary. Now, the correspondent of the Italian agency, Margherita Bastillas of ANSA, and says, in the social panorama of 2023, it is underlined that an excessive concentration of wealth can have negative effects in economic growth and increase the distrust of citizens vis-a-vis elites and institutions. In Latin America, an eruption of more liberal discourses has occurred. How can you convince governments of the importance of regulatory frameworks and increasing taxes to the billionaires? Margherita Bastillas from the ANSA Italian agency. Thank you for the question. It's not an easy question. Well, in fact, in the social panorama of this year, we have documented the high concentration of income and wealth. In the 2021, only 105 persons that have the greatest wealth in the region or have more equity and wealth accounted for 9% of GDP, of the regional GDP. And this year, the average wealth of those billionaires is $4.3 billion, and the average wealth of the rest of the population is $18,000. So a major difference. Now, the question is how to convince governments. Well, there have been several progressive uh, governments in Latin America and the Caribbean, and the issue is not so much convincing those governments that do have those intentions. Maybe others don't. But a good number of those governments have already had in their government programs the importance of moving towards a greater distribution of wealth. And this includes a clear vision of what to do. What are the leverages or the levers or factors that determine a country to reduce its inequality in wealth? And secondly, it involves something very complex, which the economists call political economy. Who has more power in a society and how is it used to support or resist to certain reforms? Brief comment on these two elements. On the subject of what is it that moves the direction, there are 4 or 5 levers. We could add others that explain the distribution of wealth and income. First, much of the inequality lies in these differences of productivity, that it prevails in our productive structure an enormous mass of informal micro enterprises, informal companies, and there are less medium-sized enterprises. And therefore, this involves policies of industrial policies of productive development to have more medium-sized, high productivity companies and try to reduce the weight of self-employment, informal employment, micro enterprises that by definition have very low productivity. There's an enormous issue there. Second, part of the inequality is because of regressive tax systems instead of progressive. And number 3, it responds to the quality and effectiveness of social policies. And that is much what Alberto Arenas has explained in social spending and social policies, that is also documented in other reports. And also an enormous dimension of inequality is gender inequality. We have Anna Westmans here, and there the division of gender has reports, important ones, of all the dimensions, structural knots of inequality. But I would like to comment tax reforms, because this is a first order challenge in all countries. We can distinguish 3 main conditioning factors of that tax reform. One is all the tax competence in attracting foreign direct investment, all that high international mobility capital. The margin of maneuver or space for maneuver is limited by the incentives offered by other countries and possibility of large companies and corporations to change their investments to other regions. That is a subject that has been raised internationally, and ECLAC, as technical secretariat, is discussing that. Another conditioning factor is the opposition of powerful groups to tax reforms impacting on them, as I said. But number 3, and this is interesting, the opposition not only comes from powerful groups, it comes from middle class groups also. Because regardless of promises in that taxes will improve the spending and services of the state based on their previous experience in many countries, this anger we are witnessing is of the middle class, and they don't believe, because of past experience, that if more resources are given to the state, more taxes are paid, health and education will improve. They are not convinced, and there is an important issue and problem for tax reforms as well. I could continue with other things, but really, I think this accounts for main ideas. And in ECLAC, we are intensely working both in the broader view of reducing inequality, as well as in tax reforms, productive development, gender issues, and other sources of inequalities. Thank you, Executive Secretary. Now we move to questions from the correspondent of Interpress Service, Orlando Milesi. And he raises two concerns. First, the report says that the sexual division of labor and the care are reasons for gender inequality in the region. What can we do to unleash those knots and really have more equality for women? And the second concern, although the reality of migration is different depending on countries in the region, it is a constant that migrants receive less salaries than the natives of countries where they migrate, and that the migrant women suffer this situation even worse. What to do for countries to comply with international signed agreements on decent work in the case of migrants? Interpress Service, Orlando Milesi. The floor is yours, Executive Secretary. Thank you, Orlando, for your question. And this gives me the opportunity to expand and elaborate what I referred to in matters of inequality and social cohesion, and that is equality between men and women. We have documented in last decades important progress in education for women, but their labor participation has not grown proportionally. That is, half of women are out of the labor market, different from men, that reach a participation rate of 75%. So depending on the country, there are 20 or 25 more percentage points in the rates of women and men. And there, because of the work of care that falls on women. And our review showed that 3 times women devote 3 times more of time than men to these domestic labor, or the society of care, or work of care. We've discussed this in large meetings. The 15th meeting of the Conference of Women in the Region, what this was discussed. And as we have said, the demand for care work is now intensified in view of the aging of the population. Not only the care for children, but women also, the care for the elderly citizens. And we are in a transition that sometimes is invisible, but it's very clear in societies that are aging. The proportion of the elderly is going to be much higher, 4 to 5 times higher than what we have today. It will be in 2050. Therefore, we need ambitious policies. And from ECLAC, we have said that society of care is a key part of that structural transformation of the development model that needs to recognize the care work as an essential right, an essential work, and it will be a sector that will be one of the major creators of jobs for nurses, caregivers, and therefore sustainability of life and of the planet refers to human dependency vis-a-vis the planet, interdependency among people, and the idea is to reach gender equality in a more sustainable and productive world. That's the ambition, but this needs to be based on measurements of cost in networks of care. There are reasons to be optimistic, yes, and with this I conclude. But we need to be proactive in the region. In the region, we have a regional gender agenda of the last 45 years within the framework of the Regional Conference of Women of Latin America and the Caribbean. The first meeting was 45 years back, and the commitment of Buenos Aires, which was the result of this 15th conference, integrated the regional gender agenda, reaffirms these principles: universality, progressiveness, and have the access to care, co-responsibility, and care for everyone. Also, financial sustainability, and recognizes the role of the state. It is indispensable joint collaboration among different sectors, including the private sector, in order to address these very important challenges. There was a question on migration. Yes, the second part was of the concern of Orlando Milesi, what to do for countries to comply with the international agreements on decent work in the case of migrants. Well, comply with those commitments involves several points. One, strengthening institutions or ministries in charge of that, including all instances of inspection, also information and transparency, training, capacity building, technical capacity building of institutions, and also management of migrations. There are several important instruments: the International Convention on the Protection of All Workers and their Families of 1990. Also, several labor specific agreements of ILO are very important to facilitate labor mobility, avoid irregularity, and protect the right to decent work. Convention number 48 of ILO, protecting the rights to pensions of migrants, and that of 97, promote equality of treatment between national and foreign workers, 143. So basically, what is recommended that countries make efforts to really regularize and have formality for migrant populations and recognize the contribution of migrants to different aspects of productive life at all levels. And we are documenting all that vision and of contribution of migrants to really balance those visions that are abundant in social media of negative thinking and a very negative reading of what these migrant flows could be. And there are many cases of societies that have productively incorporated a large proportion of migrants in a successful manner. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Executive Secretary. Luis Miguel Gonzalez, colleague from The Economist, or El Economista of Mexico. And he asks, what do we need to revert the sequels of COVID-19 in the region's labor markets, and how is it that we can implement strategies to benefit from migrants' talent? Those are the two questions by Luis Gonzalez. Thank you for your question. Well, what is it that we need to revert the sequels of labor markets? That leads us to a key aspect, which is in the report, and that has to do with labor inclusion and insertion. And it is included in the report, and it's explained active labor market policies, first of all, in order to expand insertion and inclusion opportunities, and programs to improve the supply of jobs, retraining plans, and so on, a whole vision of how to facilitate labor inclusion. Also, initiatives focusing on demand. We cannot forget that. Our emphasis when it comes is productive development policies catering for sectors that boost the economy, because they are the ones who are going to be able to create this environment. and the creation of the employment that we need. If we only work on supply, well, we might find a market that is not capable of absorbing this. We also need labor intermediation policies, employment platforms, and so on, so that we can put into contact the people that are seeking employment with the companies and organizations that are looking for workers. We need the society of care networks to overcome that 80-20 gap between men and women, so that women can join the labor market, and therefore we must focus on the incorporation of women. Another focus must be on young people. We have seen that 1 out of every 2 young people join the labor market at an informal level, and apart from that, this was aggravated as a result of the pandemic, and this is dramatic and tragic. The issue of training, short professional courses for young people, programs of practices in private companies. There are a whole series of ideas about how to go about that. This is something that we have emphasized in the report, the need to train in human capacities and to reduce those education gaps. All those initiatives are fundamental in that sense. So the second part, I believe, has already been answered, how the issue of strategies to benefit from the talent of migrants. So thank you very much. Thank you, Executive Secretary. Now we would like to entertain the question by the editor of Listín Diario, that newspaper of Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic, Candida Costa. She asks, what is the position of the Dominican Republic in terms of labor inclusion compared to other economies of the region and of the rest of the world? What is the participation of women in the region in terms of labor participation? And what is the position, what country of the region is in the best labor situation and which is in the worst condition? What are your comments in order to improve this? A question by Listín Diario of the Dominican Republic, Candida Acosta. This question will be answered by the Director of Social Development, Alberto Arenas. Thank you very much. Candida Acosta from the Dominican Republic, and we would like to begin with answering what position the Dominican Republic is in terms of labor inclusion compared to other economies in the region and of the world. As has been mentioned in this version of the Social Panorama of Latin America and the Caribbean 2023, the region is experiencing an important crisis of labor markets. That is evidenced with greater intensity over the past decade through various labor indices, and certainly the COVID-19 pandemic in 2019 deepened this trend and meant that in 2020 the job creation dropped for the first time in 70 years, as registered in the social panorama. Now, in the case of the Dominican Republic, the situation is not all that different to what is happening with other countries in the region. And in 2022, we still haven't reached the pre-pandemic employment levels. So we find a greater labor participation compared to 2019, but unemployment that is below the regional average. On the other hand, informality in the Dominican Republic is over the regional average and represents more than 50% of employed people. We can also say that around 7% of the workforce in the Dominican Republic is migrants who make an important contribution to the economy of the country, and it is estimated that in 2022 migrant workers contributed 8.7% of the GDP in the Dominican Republic. The second part of the question referred to the level of participation of women in the region when it comes to labor inclusion, and whether salaries and benefits have improved in the region. As we presented, there are still major differences and important entry barriers to remunerated work. Women are one of the most heavily impacted groups, because 1 out of every 2 women continue to be excluded from the labor market. The process to recover labor markets has not enabled a closure of the historical gaps between men and women, where during the first quarter of 2023, the gap in the rate of participation between both genders was 22.2 percentage points, similar to what was seen in the fourth quarter of 2019. And in 2023, the participation of women was 51.2% compared to 54.7% by men. And the present context implies challenges, but also implies certain opportunities. And in order to deal with gender inequalities and in order to determine how those gender inequalities impact labor inclusion. And this implies recognizing care not only as a sector that boosts the economy, but as a potential access in order to reorganize societies under the principles of gender equality and sustainability within the framework of the society of care. And in the social panorama, we emphasize the deficit in terms of policies and the lack of a care system and the need to strengthen care systems in order to deal with these gaps that we are mentioning. Now, what country in the region is best in terms of labor inclusion, and what are your recommendations in order to improve this? Well, this is not easy to answer, but basically, countries that have had a good experience, and here I would like to say a good experience in 2022. Everyone suffered a loss, and therefore the question is, well, who suffered less? Well, there we have the experiences of Uruguay and Brazil. In Uruguay in 2020, in the midst of the pandemic, the employment rate dropped by 2.4%, and this implies a drop which was 3 times less than in the rest of the region, and the recovery of labor indicators occurred before the end of 2021. In other countries, that was at the beginning of 2022 or at the end of 2022, far before most of the countries in the region, and they reached a final figure of final pre-pandemic figures in 2022. In Brazil, the employment rate dropped less than in the rest of the region, and the recovery, as in the case of Uruguay, occurred at the beginning of 2021, without increasing relative informality and dropping unemployment rates as well. On the other hand, we still have a whole set of countries in the region that face significant challenges. For example, some countries still have unemployment rates over and above 2 digits, understanding that the average in the region is 1 digit. In the case of informality, there are several countries in the region, as is the case of Bolivia, Ecuador, and Peru, that in 2022 had rates higher than those before the pandemic. And therefore, is it that we can face up to these issues? Well, the region, in our opinion, and this is expressed in the report in this panorama, we should advance in terms of productive development policies to simulate the demand for employment, and also the design of the coordination of active labor market policies. In all these cases, it is imperative for these policies not only to point towards labor insertion or to access to the labor market, but that this access be done under decent work conditions with good levels, good salary levels, and with social protection, so that they may coordinate the strategies that promote the formalization of labor with guaranteed access to social protection, and thus advance in labor inclusion and in the successful social development with inclusion. We thank our Director of Social Development, Alberto Arenas. Irma Cantisano Chang from El Economista and Prensa Gráfica of El Salvador. She asks, what is the impact on the poverty index in the Central American area? What is the impact of the climatic situation upon these aspects, and whether poverty and extreme poverty has increased in El Salvador and Central America after the end of the pandemic? Irma Cantisano Chang. Director Arenas, you have the floor. Thank you, Irma Cantisano from El Salvador. And what is the index of poverty in Central America of the climatic situation? And with regards to climate change and poverty, this relationship is complex, and certainly It is multi-dimensional in nature, and in that context, we can mention among the most significant aspects for Central America. First of all, well, we would have to say that a direct impact upon poverty and inequality, the consequences of climate change, as droughts, storms, and waves of extreme heat disproportionately hit the most vulnerable population and those that live in environments that are most susceptible to these climatic events and have less resources in order to face up to these impacts. And also, the poorest communities frequently, on average, rely on agriculture and fishing for their livelihoods, and therefore these are activities that are highly sensitive to climatic variations. And as highlighted in the document of the period of sessions of ECLAC, in the last document, estimations provided by various studies for 2021 indicate that there is an increase of between 2 and 16.7 million people living in poverty as a result of climate change in the region. And between 1.1 and 9.6 million people are the number of people that live in extreme poverty. Secondly, with regards to displacement and forced migration, climate change was provoking an increase in sea levels and more frequent and severe climatic disasters, and this, which leads to forced displacement, and that often leads to the loss of the home, of profession, and of social networks, pushing millions of people to poverty. Thirdly, food security and the lack of water. Climate change is altering rainfall patterns and exacerbating droughts, having an impact on the production of food and the supply of drinking water. The increasing lack of water impacts 1 out of every 4 people at a world level. It's expected that this number will significantly increase by 2050. And these factors certainly contribute to increasing poverty and lack of food security at a major scale. From a gender perspective, women living in poverty are less able to buffer even the most moderate climate changes, and they're the first to experience erosion and circles of poverty limiting their adaptation capabilities. Climate change is therefore an additional risk factor that can push them towards chronic poverty by having a direct and severe impact upon their means of livelihood.
Central America is one of the most exposed regions to the consequences of climate change and one of the least contributors to the production of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's key to strengthen the social protection systems. And when we have said social protection systems, we believe in those that are universal, integrated, sustainable, and resilient, especially because of disasters and climate change. And that, in fact, needs to be a priority task, not only in Central America, but in the region. The second question, I remember, was what? The number of poor people and poverty in El Salvador and Central America? Yes. The amount of persons in poverty situation grew 1.6 million persons in 2022 vis-a-vis 2019 pre-pandemic. And this growth is similar if we consider or not Mexico in that group. The extreme poverty without Mexico increased 2 million people in the same period. If Mexico is included, extreme poverty reduced or declined in 1.2 million. In the case of El Salvador, it dropped. Persons in extreme poverty grew in 200,000 persons. For 2023, it is foreseen that there will be no major changes vis-a-vis 2021. And in this situation, it's crucial to strengthen or build, promote, and advance in universal social protection systems that are sustainable and resilient. and that will help to develop strategies, including responses to emergency, and will consolidate the universal and quality access to key policies of poverty eradication in the region and by all means in Central America. Thank you, Alberto Arenas. We have already reached the time we had contemplated for this segment of questions and answers, and reiterate our gratitude to the 120 colleagues of media that through Zoom and different platforms have accompanied this presentation and this press conference. I know, of course, there are several concerns and questions that because of time we won't be able to address directly. But as we always do it in ECLAC press conferences, those of you who have sent questions, we will answer promptly in the coming hours and send back to you the answers to your questions. We have received during the conference the concerns of Andrei Celis of Costa Rica, Maria Jose Núñez from Universidad Seminole of San Jose, Milei Calazo from La Estrella, Panama, and Yvette Saldaña from El Universal of Mexico, among others. You can be certain that very promptly we will answer your concerns. Executive Secretary, to conclude this conference, a final message? Yes. 2 items. Strangely, there weren't too many questions about the poverty data. I would like to go back to that because there are good news, especially of what was expected a year back in the Social Panorama report of a year back. We expected for this year a poverty level of 32.1%, 201 million people in poverty conditions. The updated data now with information from each country is that the poverty percentage is 29%, 181 million people. We are having 20 million less than expected. What we have 12 million people less in extreme poverty. And the question is, why? Because the economic growth we are observing this year is a bit better than the one we expected in November last. And the data, specific data of that, will be announced with the launching of the preliminary balance of the region in December. So, good news, yes. Although still, when we speak of 181 million persons in a situation of poverty, is no reason to be satisfied, of course. And the other point is that the main focus of this social panorama last year was education. Today it is labor markets. We have spoken at depth on that. But it's clear that the message there and the focus, or the reason why we focus the report on this, is because later labor markets can be reproducers of inequalities, of lack of opportunities, of frustrations about the future. And if they're not dynamic, or they have many of the features that we have discussed, high level of informality, high unemployment, very little incorporation, inequality between men and women, or could be major vehicles for social mobility to reduce inequality, reduce poverty, and increase social cohesion. So there may be a lot of virtues and thus facilitate the work of social policies. And there we have emphasized a lot the importance of a higher growth. There is no way for labor markets to play this role of increasing mobility and increasing social cohesion, with the region growing only at 1%. So our emphasis is in the functionality and the relevance of having more vigorous economic growth in the region. Thank you very much. Thank you, Executive Secretary. Thank you all that have been with us in this press conference and the launching of this social panorama. All the information, all the material are already available in the website of ECLAC, and the press team of our institution will be alert in monitoring your concerns and questions. So, with your with your acceptance, we now adjourn this session. Thank you very much all.